So just a brief overview. How do we get our energy? What is fracking? Why it works in the United States? What are the prospects of fracking in Europe, especially in Germany? And then just kind of going into the environmental and the economic impacts of Germany, because, I mean, frankly, if it's going to be so bad for the environment, nobody really cares what the economic impacts will be. So I just kind of want to explain this. So in the United States, school children are drilled with this image of the food pyramid, where they tell us that the breads and the grains right here are the most important base, and the fats and the sweets up here are something that are good every once in a while, but they're not something you should try to use to sustain yourself on a daily basis. And that's kind of what we have here. So in the United States, about 0.04% of our energy comes from solar, about 1.7% comes from wind, and we have oil, natural gas, and coal, which make up the majority of our energy consumption. So you can see that a little easier in this pie chart. So 35% of all of our energy comes from oil, 28% comes from natural gas, and 18% comes from coal. And that's going to change it's going to be skewed more towards oil and natural gas in the future as we start to begin phasing out coal from our electricity generation. Nuclear is 8.5% in the United States, and all the rest of renewable energy is really kind of insignificant, and hydroelectricity actually makes up the majority of that. So because oil and natural gas are such important resources in the United States, it makes sense to question whether we're going to run out, whether there is anything to this peak oil theory. So here's a graph of the United States' oil production over time. And you can see that, we were doing pretty good here in the early 70s, but the lower 48 states started to decline pretty rapidly from then. Alaska provided a lot of oil for a little while, but they're even starting to decline quite a bit as well. And we kind of had the same story with natural gas. We had a 25% reduction in natural gas production between 2007 and 2013, and that's a really significant reduction. And the great news is fracking means we aren't running out. This is such a dramatic increase in oil production. That is the fastest that any country has ever increased their oil production. Just year over year, it was record production. We have the same thing here with natural gas. So the United States has nearly doubled its oil production since 2008, and 40% of all of our natural gas comes from fracking, and we now produce more natural gas than Russia. So in order to explain fracking, I kind of need to explain why we frack in the first place. So traditionally, our oil and gas production came from sandstone reservoirs and limestone reservoirs, and those are really easy to extract the oil because you have all this beautiful resource, and it's in the pore space in between the sand grains. So it's kind of like a cup. I could stick a straw in this glass and soak it all up, and it would be relatively easy to suck up. But here, now we're getting our oil and gas from shale reservoirs. And shale is a very fine-grained sedimentary rock, and there's a lot of pockets of oil and natural gas in the rock, but they're not interconnected, which makes it very difficult to produce hydrocarbons from that rock. So I like to think of shale as bubble wrap. You need to pop it in order to have fun and extract the oil and natural gas resource. This is just kind of a cartoon that I made to demonstrate this. So traditionally, when you stick a well into a sand reservoir, or a sandstone reservoir, as you see here, the oil and gas kind of naturally flows to the center of that well because you're pumping it up. But in the shale reservoirs, what they'll do is they'll drill down and they'll vertically angle that in order to expose the maximum amount of exposure to the target formation. So what they'll do is they'll fracture all around here in order to free up that resource and allow it to come up to the well. They use a mixture of sand, water, and chemical additives at high pressures, pressured into the rock in order to split the rock apart. And they use about 75 million to 150 million liters per well in order to do that. That's about 2 to 4 million gallons of water. They use about 4 to 5 tons of sand and the sand. I'll explain why that's important in a minute. And in the United States, the average shale well is about 7,500 feet, so that's about 2,200 meters deep. So that's a lot of rock separating the surface. So you see the water table way up here, and the shale that we're extracting the resources from is way down here. And then the chemical additives are less than 1% of the fluids. So the sand is important because it serves to keep these fractures open. You have, they kind of act like pillars at the Parthenon, so you have these little sand grains that are wedged right here, and as you can see, it allows the resource to flow through with a lot more. Basically, if you didn't use the sand, it wouldn't be economical in order to frack. So let's talk about why the United States. So it's kind of three factors that are all very interconnected. We have the geology, which is always important. That's the most important thing when it comes to extracting a resource. You have the technology, which can you develop it in an economic way? And then in the United States, it's private property rights for minerals that really was the impetus for us developing fracking in the first place. Because the United States is really the only country in the world where average Joes like myself can own the mineral rights and profit from that. So that works in order to increase our incentive to develop the technology in order to access these resources. And it also is a big incentive to start doing the exploration and development that you need to do in order to find the resources in the first place. So I usually just put this slide in there to make the joke about shale energy. Don't take it for granted, which I don't know if that translates, but I figured I would still put it in there. So this is where all the magic is happening. Texas is one of the largest producers of oil and natural gas in the world. If Texas were its own country, it would be about the 8th or 9th largest oil-producing country in the world. We have a lot of oil produced in the Bakken region of North Dakota, and the Marcellus Shale here, which is about a 4-state territory, has become the largest gas-producing region in the country. So yeah, let's look at the European shale deposits because, I mean, obviously we want to be able to see if this is transferable to other countries. So we have France, which decided to ban fracking. So it's not likely that they're going to access their reserves. Also, Germany has had a moratorium, although I've read some things recently to where exploratory wells are starting to be used a little bit. But this is really important because Germany is the largest consumer and importer of natural gas in Europe, and most of that comes from Norway and our friend Vlad. Yeah. I don't know why he feels the need to always have his shirt off, but riding a shark is pretty impressive. So like I said before, Germany is the 3rd largest importer of natural gas in the world. So it would be beneficial if you guys didn't have to import all of that and could do some domestic gas production as well. The obstacles to that are obviously the environmental movement here is very well organized, and they're very opposed to it. And also, it helps when they have so much money at stake. So their lobbying efforts have been very robust. All right, so just to kind of get into it, there's about a 14-year supply that's been discovered right now of natural gas. So you wouldn't have to import for 14 years. And the way that these things work is it's all dependent on price. So, there's probably a lot more natural gas in the rocks, in the resource, but it's all dependent on what is the price at the current time. So, Germany-specific objections. So, one of the things I hear a lot is, that might be great for the United States because you guys have a lot of wide open spaces and you're, sparsely populated in some of these areas. But fracking is actually happening in quite a few densely populated areas like the Barnett Shale of Texas, which is home to Dallas-Fort Worth, which is one of the larger cities in the country. And then I actually read an article that was protesting because of the beer. They said the beer brewers here said it would contaminate the water. That was important for their business. But Colorado is one of the states that uses a lot of fracking, and they actually have the most microbreweries per capita out there. So I just thought that was interesting in case you were talking about fracking with your friends later, and they'd say, well, what about the beer? You can say, it's okay. It won't do anything to that. So let's talk about the environmental impacts. And this usually takes the form of water contamination. People are worried about the chemicals, and also earthquakes. So you guys probably know that scene from The Wizard of Oz. But I don't want to be dismissive of that, because like I said earlier, if you don't have a clean environment, what are the economic impacts worth? You know, everyone's like, oh, well, that's not worth giving up the cleanliness of our environment to make a few dollars. So will fracking have an impact? Yeah, of course it will. Everything that we do in this world has an impact, and you have to be honest about that. So the real question becomes, can you mitigate the impacts and maximize the benefits? And that's what hydrogeologists are for. It's what engineers are for, petroleum engineers. And one thing I like to say, tourism is usually promoted as a very green way of fostering economic development, but people don't even really understand that that's one of the ways that invasive species are spread the most. So I live in Wisconsin, and we have a problem with the zebra mussel and the emerald ash borer. So people are either moving from one body of water to another without cleaning their boat well enough, or they're taking firewood from one area, traveling a couple hundred miles, and burning it there, which also has an environmental impact. So everybody just needs to be honest about that, because that's really the only way that you can have a truthful discussion. And like we said, there's impacts and drawbacks to everything. And this happens. I mean, not only are they inefficient, but sometimes they fail. So I don't need to really get into that. But this is the thing I really need to talk about. If I talk about one thing in this talk, this is the thing I need to talk about. Because once the anti-fracking movement kind of came to Europe, they went around showing the movie Gasland. And the most powerful image about fracking, hands down, is the image where he's setting his water on fire. But this was actually completely falsified because this gentleman had drilled his well through a coal bed, which I'm sure all of you know is a natural source of methane. So he was going to be able to set his water on fire regardless of whether fracking had ever even been invented. And then as far as water contamination is concerned, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency conducted the most extensive analysis of the impact of fracking on water. And they said, there are instances where it has contaminated water supplies, but on the whole, these are rare, and this is not going to lead to a widespread or systemic impact. That means it doesn't necessarily have to impact your water supplies, as long as you have the proper procedures and environmental protections. And the guy who created the film Gasland was not happy about that. But that's why I like to include his tweet, kind of as a little schadenfreude. So this is what anti-fracking people like to say is going to happen. They're going to say that this is going to migrate upwards into the water table and it's going to be contaminated. This can't happen. There's simply too much rock in between the shale development, the shale reservoirs, and the water table for that to realistically ever happen. But what can happen is you can have a situation where you have a crack in your well casing, and that can lead to methane gas escaping. One of the reasons why this does not contaminate the water is because we use layers of steel and cement. These are usually, several different layers. So you'll have, maybe 40 inches of steel and cement that are cased until the water table, and then you'll use successively fewer as you go down into the target formation. But this is all put in place to make sure that you have the minimum impact possible. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the chemicals, but not a lot. So the mixture of sand, water, and chemicals is often referred to as fracking fluid, is 99.5% sand and water, and there's only, less than 0.5% of chemicals that are used. And most of these are used in everyday household items like, lipstick or soap, and they're not found in concentrations that are, at least in the water table, that are considered hazardous. One of the things that has become more controversial in the United States is you're using a lot of water in order to frack these wells, and 15 to 20% of that water returns to the surface as wastewater. So you have to dispose of that wastewater somehow. Some states, like Pennsylvania, require that you recycle it. They recycle more than 90% of their wastewater. In other places, they inject it into lower formations in order to make sure that it is not contaminating the water supply. And those are all regulated by EPA as well. And in rare circumstances, those have caused induced seismicity. So the earthquakes associated with fracking aren't caused by the fracking itself. The fracturing of the rocks is done at such a low energy that it's not likely to cause an earthquake. But when you dispose of the wastewater, you can essentially reduce the effective stress of the tectonic plates, and that will cause a slippage. So that's been happening a lot in Oklahoma, even though not all of that is from the fracking itself. A lot of people don't realize that there's a lot of brine in the rocks that we produce oil and natural gas from naturally. So there's all different kinds of water that needs to be reduced. So talking about the water consumption, in the United States, it uses less than 1% of the water used every year for other purposes. So you'll see here, this is a map of where they have the most water consumption due to fracturing. And this is a lot less than we use for biofuels. It's a lot less than we use for some sorts of coal. So the water consumption is, it sounds significant, but in the broad scheme of things, it doesn't use as much as you might think. And when we're talking about environmental impacts, it's not all bad. The way that we're able to drill really enables us to reduce the amount of surface disturbance and maximize the amount of resource that we can drill. So right here, we have 6 wells drilled, and they're harvesting resources from a lot of different places. So this is what it looks like, in reality. And this is what it would have to look like if we were going to get the same amount of resources without the horizontal fracking. It's just one of those things where we are able to reduce our footprint. So this is just an example of 51 wells that were drilled from a single pad in Colorado. And then you can also talk about greenhouse gas reductions, because obviously burning natural gas emits half the carbon dioxide of burning coal. So there's really not a good reason for anybody to not like fracking for natural gas, in my opinion. And that's one of the reasons why the United States has reduced their carbon dioxide emissions more than any other country over the last few years. So the economic impacts of fracking, this has actually affected the whole world. Germany has actually benefited quite a bit from fracking already, even though you might not directly realize it, because the amount of oil that the United States has introduced into the market has caused oil prices to decline, but it's also caused natural gas prices to decline, because Russia ties their price of natural gas to the price of oil. So the fracking revolution in America has really sent shockwaves throughout the rest of the country. And diesel fuel in the United States is about $2.34 a gallon right now, which is really nice. And in the Bakken Shale of North Dakota, people were starting at $17 an hour for a starting job at Walmart, which is pretty significant. And the consumer savings, the average family is saving about $700 on gas this year. And when you add in their savings for oil and natural gas, a single mother with 2 kids living in Detroit is saving about $1,500, which that's a lot of money. I wouldn't mind having an extra check for $1,500 lying around that I could cash. So really, when you think about it, that's the equivalent of working 225 hours at the federal minimum wage. So if the $1,500 doesn't speak to you, the 225 hours really should. The economic impacts, hundreds of thousands of jobs have been created in the United States. They're looking at millions by the time that we start really producing these, but obviously this is going to be dependent upon oil prices going into the future. It'll be really interesting to see whether OPEC is going to cave. I mean, nobody really knows. If I knew, I would have tons of money invested in the stock market, and I would just be waiting to cash out. Also, just from a competitive advantage standpoint, the price of natural gas per million cubic feet or million cubic meters is far below what you guys have to pay here in Germany and far below Asia. So that's why we even had a few German steel plants relocate to Houston in order to save enough money on the energy costs alone, made up for the wage and the labor and that sort of stuff. So the United States is experiencing a lot of manufacturing coming back to the United States as far as really energy-intensive industries like steel making and fertilizer and plastics, that sort of thing. And that's something that any country that decides to harness their natural resources can do. And I think that'd probably be a really good thing to do, considering electricity prices in Germany are 3 times higher than they are in the United States. So yeah, that's basically the conclusion. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those for you.